of the universal language of description and mobilization of a heterogeneous society, presenter Mark Lipovetsky, The Culture of the Technical Intelligentsia in the 1960s and today, towards a discussion of Soviet and post-Soviet discourses.
На которой представители социальных и гуманитарных наук совместно обсуждают вопросы, которые имеют прямое отношение к нашей нынешней реальности в самом широком понимании. И нам кажется, что задача социальных и гуманитарных наук состоит в том,
Hello and welcome to the seminar that the Imperio journal plans as an experimental space to discuss the issues indirectly related to our present-day reality. We think that the task of the humanities and social sciences is to create new ideas of reality and to process the language which could be used for its analysis. We are thoroughly grateful to Mark Lipovetsky for accepting our offer and agreeing to take part in the experiment together with us. I don't think Mark needs a special introduction, but just in case, I am going to remind you that he is a philologist and literary critic, a professor of Okay. So if you read the Imperio, if you read the Open Space, you definitely are supposed to know the name. And if you're following the literary situation in Russia, you surely know the name of Mark Lipovetsky. Mark is the chairman of the panel of judges in the NOS Literary Award started by the Prokhorov Foundation. So I think that specialists anyway have heard of him and heard of his treatment of modernism and postmodernism.
Тема сегодняшнего выступления Марка Липовецкого «Культура ИТР в 60-е и сегодня». Разговор о советском и постсоветском дискурсе модернизации, поэтика дискурса. И порядок работы сегодня такой. Марк выступит, а затем мы приглашаем всех комментировать, задавать вопросы. И, в общем, чем активнее вы обсуждение, тем, я думаю, нам всем будет.
Mark's today's topic is the culture of the technical intelligentsia in the 1960s and today, towards the discussion of Soviet and post-Soviet discourses. The working order is that we first give the floor to Mark, then we're inviting everyone to comment and ask questions. The more actively you join the discussion, the more interesting the seminar will be. Thank you. Marina, thank you so much for a wonderful introduction. I'm very flattered, and I'd like to start by extending my thanks to Marina Mogilner and the Imperio editorial team, who invited me to this very interesting conference, which has just finished a couple of hours ago. I was delighted to take part in this event and to come to Kazan, which I must admit I'm ashamed I've never have visited, although I spent over 30 years in the city of Sverdlovsk, Yekaterinburg, which is not far from here. So I have my report all printed here. First of all, just to fit in the time. So I apologize if it looks a bit boring just because I'm reading, but I hope you will come up later with your questions and commentary, and the second part of the seminar would thus be more lively than the first. So here I go with my text. It was not so far ago, in early 2010, when I published in the Open Space magazine a column named The Abyss of the Technical Intelligentsia, where I laid out my claims against the modern cultural mainstream, which is limited, as I thought, from the discourse of the technical intelligentsia as formed by the 1960s and going through some dramatic transformations in the following decades. The column somehow created a certain stir. I thought I touched on a nerve of the modern condition. And the snow revolution that followed after a year, at the first sight, has not confirmed my pessimism concerning the dominant cultural states. The former technical intelligentsia, the new office people, which I understand as its direct heir, and the representatives of the complex culture of the humanities, together with the nationalists and the left, acted together as a new social and political unity. And it is no surprise that the phrase creative class, borrowed from the book by Richard Florida under the same name, I was totally enthralled by the social space and scale and cultural energy of this movement. And I was not the only person to have association with the times of perestroika. Except for the internet, it was very much the same, similar. There's a clear idea of a common enemy as the hated regime, a community which arose on this place between people who were opponents not long ago. The non-formed ideas of what to do next, first of all, is to bring the regime down, and then it will somehow work out on a new honest ground by itself, and the winged euphoria, which appeared from the combination of all these factors, and the feeling of being together and the agreement with people who think the same and that there are so many. This probably very subjectively emotional rhyme first brought a lot of joy, but then grew into a certain frustration. Is it true that the whole experience of racial cultural history after the perestroika was in vain, and the intelligentsia is back to the point from where it began at the end of the 80s, not learning anything new except the internet? I want to emphasize that this may be quite subjective. Frustration gave a new meaning to my attempts to work out with the discourse of the technical intelligentsia of the 60s, which I view as a core and basis for the late Soviet and post-Soviet specific liberalism. So what follows is my attempts to clear up my own position in three questions. One, how the liberal discourse of the 1960s technical intelligentsia was formed, what kind of change it went through during the post-Soviet time, and three, if any transformation of it into the ideology of a creative class is possible. So technical intelligentsia, I start with that, is a kind of a bad word, and the cultural medium united by it was not only engineers and technical intelligentsia proper. The very class of technical intelligentsia formed in the 1930s, as Sheila Fitzpatrick said, this is probably kind of a Soviet middle class, which formed the basis of the Stalinist socialism. Dubin, Gudkov, and Levinson viewed them as a late Soviet version of a middle class, and Western analytics, as far back as the 1960s, characterized this intelligentsia as the most educated group of the Soviet elite, or privilegentsia. But in the 1960s, it was this group who created the most energetic and massive support to the Khrushchev thaw and formed the core of liberal Soviet intelligentsia. These were the people that formed the halls of the Polytechnical Museum. They were the audience for Galich and Vysotsky. Their humor became widely accepted. Their songs formed the Bard movement. The free thought in this medium was achieved as an important precondition for scientific efficiency, even when the Stalin was alive. In the days of the thaw, marked by an exponential growth of technical intelligentsia, free thinking in the closed research institutions started moving out of the limits of the privileged stratum. As Zubok proved, from 1950 to 1965, the number of researchers and scientists in the USSR grew from 162,000 to 665,000, which was the example of the quickest growth anywhere in the world. Albert Perry, in his book The New Class Divided, Science and Technology versus Communism, quite decisively thought that if in our permissive society, American scientists, engineers, and other technical experts do not constitute one class or even a group, then under the much more restrictive conditions of the Soviet socio-political order, the comparable Soviet intelligentsia has even less of a chance to get together as a unified force to challenge the Communist Party. End of quote. You can clearly see now Perry was wrong. It was precisely the presence of a common enemy, personified as communists in the Soviet power, did not only rally the technical intelligentsia, but gave its ideology a status of a flagship strand of thought of liberal modernization for all of the intelligentsia. Or, as Zubok says again, scientists became the first group of highly educated people in the late 1950s and early 60s whose influence on society and cultural life far surpassed their professional competence. As Zubok also shows, during the thaw, when the writers could not take control of the literary events, the technical intelligence and the researchers, on the contrary, more and more vigorously liberated itself from the party and ideological control, cultivated intellectual freedom, which was notably absent in the humanities. Vailen Guinness wrote in the book 1960s, The World of a Soviet Man. Researchers became not just heroes. Public opinion turned them into the aristocrats of the spirit. Researchers were thought to come as a new generation and take over from politicians. Sciences would replace ideology. Technocracy instead of patocracy would leave the country further on to utopia. As the researcher's position was expressed by academic Kapitsa, to rule by law and order and democratically, every country must absolutely have independent institutions which act as arbiters in every problems. And the Soviet Union, this moral function belongs to the Academy of Sciences. Analogous was the position of academician Sakharov, who began his famous article Reflections on Progress, Peaceful Coexistence and Intellectual Freedom, 1968, with the following important statement. The views of the author have formed an milieu of the scientific and scientific-technological intelligentsia, which manifests much anxiety over the principles and specific aspects of foreign and domestic policy and over the future of mankind. This anxiety is nourished in particular by a realization that the scientific method of directing policy, the economy, arts, education, and military affairs still has not become a reality. We regarded scientific a method based on deep analysis of facts, theories, and views, presupposing unprejudiced, unfearing open discussions and conclusions. The complexity and diversity of all the phenomena of modern life, the great possibilities and dangers linked with the scientific technical revolution and with a number of social tendencies demand precisely such an approach, as has been acknowledged in a number of official statements. End of quote from Andrei Sakharov. Despite the fact that the references that both models could be somehow compatible with official statements, the new ideas of freedom and progress born among the technical intelligentsia have quickly left the limits of the official dogma. The famous physicist Landau is known from his KGB dossier as far back as in 1956 actually said, "Our system remains fascist and simply cannot change. It is ludicrous to hope that this system can lead us to something good. If our system cannot collapse peacefully, then a third world war with all its horrors is inevitable. Therefore, the issue of a peaceful dissolution of our system is the vital issue for the future of all humankind." It is no surprise that most of the notable dissidents of the 1970s hail from technical intelligentsia. The physicists such as Turchin and Altshuler, biophysicists such as Kovalov, Bukovsky, and Geres Medvedev, mathematicians as Albrecht, Kormer, Yesenin, Volpin. Vadim Delaunay, although he graduated from the Department of Philology, comes from the family of famous mathematicians, and he himself studied in a special mathematical secondary school. Lyudmila Alexeyeva graduated from the Faculty of History, Moscow University, but her mother is also a famous mathematician and author of university textbooks, who worked in the Institute for Mathematics of the Academy of Sciences, the Soviet Union, and so on. So I'd like to venture saying that the understanding of the modernization in the 1960s formed into the discourse of technical intelligentsia soon united the whole liberal intelligentsia, or probably all of the intelligentsia which considered themselves liberal. This clarification is very important. Leaving behind the Soviet ideological construct, the ideas of freedom and the idea of personality were very specific for the USSR, and they had very little in common to the understanding of liberalism outside of the USSR. That's why a crucial event for European and economic liberalism, student revolution of 1968, came almost unnoticed for the Russian liberals. That's why some of the people who call themselves liberals in the present-day Russia are closer to the Republican agenda in the USSR rather than to the liberal parties proper. But of course, the thing was not limited to politics. Throughout the Soviet period, politics could not be separated from cultural phenomena, and it was in the field of culture that the main political processes happened during the Soviet period. The first proper declaration of technical intelligentsia discourse as cultural phenomenon became a very wide and noisy discussion of the so-called physicists and lyricists, now sadly completely forgotten, but Konstantin Bogdanov has given a detailed analysis of this discussion recently. And he was quite right to say that its main characteristics was a high degree of empty words and pathos. This discussion started in the Komsomolskaya Pravda and then moved further to take over the whole society and be reflected in many newspapers. And the core of the discussion was when the scientific and technological process makes literature and arts obsolete and unnecessary. This was all generated by a probably prefabricated letter in which a girl complained that, let's say it now, her boyfriend, but then this word was not used, said that from his point of view art is absolutely useless. So why did this all end in a huge wave of empty talk? Probably the reason was that the basis of the discussion was a changed thesis. Because if any debate on what mankind needs more, the culture of feelings or the progress of science, were totally meaningless, because really this was just a mask for a very different collision, and that is the intelligence of the period of the thaw was fully disappointed with the possibilities arts and literature can offer, as they are fully imbibed with ideological mythology and the lies of socialist realism. I must remind you, this was before the publication of Solzhenitsyn's A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, and Pasternak's Dr. Zhivago and the works of Abram Terz and Nikolai Arzhak and other forms of samizdat were still widely unknown to the public, and anyway they could not be discussed in the Soviet press. In this context, scientific approach could be perceived not just as free from Soviet ideology, but openly standing against this ideology. As Vaillant Guinness wrote many years later, after they discovered that words are just lies, formulas got more people's trust. The real impossibility to discuss the true topic of the discussion led to these demagogic clashes about physicists and lyricists. This discussion often was put on the same level with a famous article by Charles B. Snow on two cultures, scientific and humanitarian, which has lost any points of connection. But I think that's kind of a wrong example, because in the Soviet culture the situation was totally different. Again, as Zubok says, even the literary vanguard during the thaw seemed to recognize the supremacy of scientists. By literary vanguard, he means Voznесensky and other poets. For all their personal candor and linguistic experimentation, the young poets of the thaw could not and did not offer a universal and global alternative to the discredited official ideology. End of quote. But scientists could offer an alternative. Deprived of a real authoritative opposition from any visible public humanitarian culture, which was too dependent on ideology, the technical intelligentsia started created its own cultural environment. Physicists did not crack jokes. It was a very famous collection of texts called Physicists Cracking Jokes. But they wrote very good poetry, as Herzen Kopylov, who was an atomic scientist, or a neurobiologist Sukharev, or they could be working in the field of prose, as the famous writer Makanin, graduated from the mathematical faculty of MGU, or the professor of math, Elena Wenzel, known since 1652 as E. Grekova, from the Latin name for the letter Y. As Gregory Pomerantz wrote in his article The Man from Nowhere, he now had a new need to somehow to see what your spiritual identity is, remaining an intellectual and not leaving your research institution. This was some sort of the Renaissance turned the other way. In the days of Renaissance, remaining artists became mathematicians, whereas now mathematicians, remaining what they were, became artists. But the most important thing was not what kind of education and all background authors of the 16th or 70s culture had. Their cultural values formed in its environment of technical intelligentsia were spread further, not only by and just by those people who were not technical intelligentsia themselves. It is quite noticeable that the famous Shurik from Leonid Gaidai's comedic cinematic trilogy is a very typical technical intelligentsia. In one of the movies, Operation Y, he passes his exam in a technical institution. In Ivan Vasilievich Back to the Future, 1973, he invents the time machine, but in Kidnapping Caucasian Style, he suddenly becomes a philologist specializing in folklore. The social science fiction by the Strugatsky brothers, 9 Days in 1 Year, a movie by Michael Brom, the already mentioned Gaidai films of the Shurik cycle, Colleagues, and other works by Vasily Aksanov, who was a doctor by education, Into the Storm and Such a Strange Life by Granin, graduated from the Leningrad Polytechnical Institution, Bratsk Power Station by Yevtushenko, and the Oza by Voznесensky, who was an architect by trade. Vertical, a movie by Gavaruchin, who graduated from the geology department. These are some of the noticeable but important cultural phenomena where the discourse of technical intelligentsia flourished its rhetoric and its ideas of society. So we should not forget that the appeal of Yuri Lotman for the literary studies to become a science meant not that it should be liberated from ideological pressure, but also the acceptance of the methods of the sciences. It is precisely on this basis that mathematical linguistics, Russian version of structuralism, and semiotics appears. The idea, discourse, and culture thus forms by taking over some related phenomena, for example, the youth prose, and drawing a boundary between itself and the events and tendencies which are first perceived as relevant, but then found as incompatible with the liberal concept. At the same time, the technical intelligentsia discourse preserves its inner structure, although it undergoes some transformation in the post-Soviet period. But the main point of my hypothesis is it's exactly the technical intelligentsia discourse that forms the cultural mainstream of late Soviet and post-Soviet liberalism. Of course, the technical intelligentsia discourse was not the only thing in the whole spectrum of intellectual and cultural formation of the 60s and 70s. On the one hand, on parallel courses went the genesis of the nationalist discourse with its all red and white, orthodox and pagan versions. I refer you to a very important polemic between Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn. On the other hand, the underground developments of proto and postmodern discourse are also notable, together with many variations from Moscow conceptualism to Leningrad religious modernism. The split between Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, which formed the two main strands of Soviet anti-Sovietism, the liberal and nationalist ones, or Enlightenment and romantic ones, is still in a way urgent up to now, is both notable and hugely influential. Solzhenitsyn also passed through the technical environment. He graduated from the Faculty of Physics and Mathematics at Rostov University, and then he worked in a secret research institution during his Gulag days. But the social-cultural vision of Solzhenitsyn was very different from this technical discourse, although it goes back to the same intellectual paradigm. Again, I venture to say that this communality lies in the fact that both Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn's concept of modernization of Russia are built around the essentialist categories. In the case of Sakharov, it's progress. In the case of Solzhenitsyn, it's nation. It was this essentialism, the idea of objective and unchangeable nature of intellectual constructions, that comes not just from the technical conscience. In a way, it's a reflected version of essentialism of the Soviet ideology with its two meaning centers, human progress and the Soviet nation. Solzhenitsyn puts into the focus the category of the nation, which completely takes over personality and is opposed to the Soviet nation and the cosmopolitan or intelligentsia version of the nation. Sakharov puts in the focus the category of progress, also understood as an absolute value and interpreted first of all as the serious extension in personal freedom. A quotation from Sakharov: "I am likewise convinced that freedom of conscience, together with other civic rights, provides the basis for scientific progress and constitutes a guarantee that scientific advances will not be used to despoil mankind. This view differs essentially from the widely accepted Marxist view, as well as the technocratic opinions according to which it is precisely material factors, social and economic conditions that are of decisive importance." It is from this abstract non-definite status of the category of personality in the technical discourse come many of its later transformations, connected with the search, with the quest for rooting in religion, blood and soil, or imperial greatness, well, roughly moving towards the Solzhenitsyn strand. But this also gives rise to a very attractive characteristic of a subject of this culture as irony. Irony is kind of a distancing from many meta-narratives, but not all ones. But first of all, from Soviet quasi-religiousness, with more disappointment as time goes on in the communist utopia as well. Science, progress, personal freedom are not corroded by irony. This gives rise to constant collision in a 1960s plots in cinema and literature, an so-called ironist who at first seems to be not giving a damn about anything, at the end of the plot heroically turns himself into a sacrifice, usually to science. I must note that the ironic hero of the technical intelligentsia culture is almost always a man. In the mass forms of the discourse, such as the songs or subculture of tourists or alpinists, appears the cult of an educated macho, a real man who pushes women into the backside roles of a pliant lover or a war bride. Thus, the most important element of the technical intelligentsia discourse, becoming mainstream of late Soviet and post-Soviet liberalism, is essentialism and the binary status, binarity that it creates. When you transfer it into the sphere of culture, these categories create the essentialization of culture, which at the end, the culture is viewed not as a dynamic and contradictory process, but as a set of eternal values. We do not expect that culture would problematize these values, but that it would confirm ready-made ideas, not the productive discomfort which was described by Batkin and Vatimo, but the guarding of the unchangeable and long perceived truth, not subverting the created hierarchies, but guarding them. It is on this ground, in the first decade of the new millennium, that the neo-traditionalist turn happens, diagnosed by Gudkov again. It is not limited to the role of the technical intelligentsia, but as a forming basis for the liberal mainstream and culture, has no resistance to neo-traditionalism of Putin style. To justify this phenomenon, Gudkov paid attention to the fact that in late 1980s, only 3% of all research was the share of social sciences and humanities. That led to the domination of didactic thought and cultural isolationism, together with the complex of cultural exceptionalism. Essentialization of culture creates such a new characteristics of the technical intelligentsia discourse as a tendency to binary simplification and resistance to any complexity. That's why the culture of Gaidai Shurik, readers of Hemingway, Strugatsky brothers, Aksionov, fans of Yevtushenko and others, now has transformed into the culture of Dmitry Bykov, Veller, Minaev, Grishkovets, Emelin, Nasha Russia and Uralsky Pelmen, Pavlovsky and Medvedev. That's why all the new cultural authorities of liberal mainstream act as deputies, standing in for some cult figures of the late Soviet period: Bykov for Yevtushenko, Shenderovich for Zhvanetsky, Lukyanenko for Strugatsky, Shevchuk for Vysotsky, and so on. Pelevin is the only person not have the prototype, but he's more a critic than the proponent of this culture. This is why, and not just because the closeness of the group, as Dubin and Gudkov think, the culture of the underground was mostly not requested by the intelligent mass. From Prigov's Militsioner to Sasha Sokolov, not to say of Nekrasov, Kubanov, Aronzon, Krivulin, Kharitonov, Bogdanov, Elena Schwartz and their disciples and their heirs, the so-called complex poets and authors of today. It is not strange that a modern critic, looking at the present-day situation, looking very much like suspiciously like 1960s and 70s, diagnosed the same situation but having created organically without the intervention from the state organs. It seems, the quote goes, it seems that the Russian literature for about 10 years is experiencing two rises. On the one hand, there's the rise of the novel of ideas, new realism, genre literature with ideological background. On the other hand, it's the growth and the rise of flourishing of innovative poetry and small prose. These are two literary fields which have no space of dialogue. This is like two synchronous times that are out of touch with each other. If you can't find any consensual authorities, they only are formally linked. It was this organic resistance to complexity which led to the fact that the technical intelligentsia discourse, which is enlightenment in its nature, has fully ignored the criticism of enlightenment underway in the European and American culture post-1968. Started shortly after the Second World War by Adorno and Horkheimer and continued by Foucault, Derrida, Lyotard, Agamben and Nancy, led to the forming of a new cultural paradigm, which you, with a certain degree of conditionality, you can call it post-structuralist. Probably it would be more correct to call it post-ideological, post-utopian, because it's methodically and progressively creates subversion, attacking faith of progress and the single meaning of scientific knowledge, creates the link between metaphysics and violence, power and the order of things seemingly natural. And most importantly, it shows how the Enlightenment vigorousness becomes a foundation for terror. We cannot say that these ideas have totally gone out of the late Soviet cultural medium. You can just look at the philosophic circle of Pятигорский and Merdashvili. But generally, the late Soviet and post-Soviet discourse remained up to this level. The Enlightenment energy created on the belief in progress, provided by means of reason, science, and technology, including political technology, placed those who were the carriers of this discourse in the position of double opposition, both opposition to the state and people. On the one hand, resistance to the absurdity of the Soviet state system, on the other hand, resistance to the idiocy of the so-called dark masses. In his manifesto, Sakharov formulated this way: freedom of thought in the modern society is under triple threat. From the calculated opium of mass culture, from cowardly and egoistical ideology of the Philisters, and from ossified dogmatism of bureaucratic oligarchy and its famous weapon, ideological censorship. Mass culture and Philister ideology act here as synonyms because both terms actually act as a substitution for the Soviet ideology of the nation. It's interesting that the technical discourse keeps the Soviet understanding of Philisters, giving them a new meaning. The Soviet discourse transformed the word «мещане» from its meaning as a socialist state into a political label to stir hatred against a certain living practices and everyday comfort. Then in the technical discourse, «мещанин» and «philister» act as antipodes of a free personality, usually with a capitalized P, and actually rather as a euphemism, standing for a sacral, for the Soviet context, category of the nation. This collision is very well played by the Strugatsky brothers in their book Snail on the Slope. In the travestied form, this struggle has been reborn by Lukyanenko in his Night Watch, Day Watch series of books. The fight between the powers of light and dark powers is shown as the struggle between the constructive, suprapersonal state powers against the destructive powers of individualist freedom. The forces of light are characterized as follows: a burning heart, clean hands, and a cool head. It is not of a sudden that in the revolutionary days and the Civil War, forces of light joined the Cheka almost completely. And those who did not join the Cheka, they just died out. They were killed by the powers of the dark, or rather died of the hands of those who they protected. They died of human stupidity, human cowardice, human envy. Dmitry Bykov, in his book Zhede, sees the same collision transformed into an eternal civil war of the Varangians, supporters of the state, and liberals, Zhede. Both parties of the conflicts are shown as equally destructive. They are a constant victim, and their own stumbling block is one more essentialist image, the Vasky, the true nation, which keeps its secret culture and identity. It was from this double collision that a specific technical intelligentsia liberalism sprang out, which was both anti-totalitarian and anti-democratic. Such oxymoronic combinations, idealism and pragmatism, total irony and hierarchic consciousness, anti-Marxism and relying on implicitly perceived Marxist dichotomies, massiveness and split into small sects, intellectual clubs, tourist clubs, and so on. This all stems from the double negativity of this discourse. Double negativity of the technical intelligentsia discourse places the hero from the intelligentsia into the position of exceptionalism. They're often compared to magicians, wizards, as in Strugatsky's Monday Begins on Saturday, or surrounded with the halo of heroic self-sacrifice, as in the movie 9 Days in 1 Year. When this feeling is transferred to the dissident movement, understood as fight for social progress, this exceptionalism is superimposed with the understanding of deep, tragic alienation. As the technical intelligentsia discourse becomes mainstream for the whole liberal culture, this complex is spread over the whole liberal intelligentsia, also essentializing in the process. As Vladimir Korma says, not a single human on the planet, never anyone, as much as Russian intelligence, has been alienated from his country, his state. Nobody like him felt himself totally alien, not to other people, not to society, not to God, but to their land, their people, their state power. Kormer was also the man to show how the understanding of exclusivity and alienation feeds up this phenomenon that he described as the double consciousness of the intelligentsia. Intelligentsia does not accept the Soviet power, he says. It leaves it behind, abandons it, often hates it. On the other hand, they live in a symbiotic relationship. It feeds it, nurtures it, and nourishes it. Intelligentsia is waiting for the collapse of the Soviet power and hopes this collapse sometimes happens. But at the same time, cooperates with it. It suffers because it has to live under Soviet power, and at the same time, on the other hand, it strives to a better life. Intelligentsia would like to think the Soviet power is something external, as a phenomenon, as a danger attacking somewhere from the outside, but could never completely think over this point of view. The diagnosis that Kormer put in his article, which is published under the pen name of Altaev in 1970s, could be further illustrated by two quotations. The first comes from the book of Barvailan Genis, again the 60s, The World of the Soviet People. You have to remember that the Soviet physicists, the quotation goes, have never went through the moral trials of Hiroshima. The image of a Frankenstein was alien to the Russian imagination. The Soviet Frankenstein, we could add, was a goofy robot played by Oleg Strizhanov in the movie His Name Was Robert. Second quotation comes from Dina Khapayeva's book The Gothic Society. She's talking about the mass idealization of Russia, which took control of Russian society in late 80s, early 90s, as a form of living through the change which led to the fact that the Russian consciousness started denying its connection with the Soviet past. Thanks to the efforts of the westernizers, the more detailed became the picture of the bad Soviet past, the stronger became the desire to attach this past not to oneself, but to the alien regime. The very fact of condemning this regime gave a chance to feel yourself having no part in it. The condemnation of Stalinism led to the fact that the Soviet past became an alien past, somebody else's history, with no relation to those who decided to set up Russia once again. To open a road for the Russia into the West, the Soviet past had to disappear in the abyss of oblivion. The presence of the Soviet past just totally destroyed faith in progress. End of quote. The absence of any feeling of guilt or responsibility for the terrible military power of the Soviet regime is quite typical for many, but not for all, representatives of technical intelligentsia in the 60s. This is a peculiar version, a peculiar case of double consciousness, maybe in its purest. Bringing us back to the quotation about, do you think about the Soviet past as something external? But it was this double consciousness, fully justified by the liberal discourse of the technical intelligentsia, as Khapayeva shows, that creates the certain serious problem that the Soviet past was not thought over, and this hangs over the whole post-Soviet culture. This absence of thinking over the Soviet catastrophe, as it was many times demonstrated by researchers, gave rise in the post-Soviet period to not just nostalgia for the Soviet, but to, sadly, representation of many cultural and social practices of late socialism. Absolutization of progress in the post-Soviet period is seen to be leaving the technical intelligentsia discourse. You can see this not from the historical fantasies of Fomenko, but in the very well-thought cyclical concept of Russian history with its 4 stages, as developed by Dmitry Bykov. And the 4 stages are reform attempts, crackdown, thaw, and then stagnation or dementia. And although there is no place in this context for the idea of progress, the complex of intelligentsia as an representative as an exceptional figure, as the carrier of liberal modernization, is preserved fully intact. This transformation can be clearly seen by juxtaposing the works of Strugatsky brothers and Viktor Pelevin, the authors in whose works the technical intelligentsia discourse of the 60s and 70s and then of the end of century and the beginning of the new millennium was most openly embodied. The central figure of the work of the Strugatsky brothers, starting from the 1960s, is the progressor figure, which is an easy-to-guess projection of a liberal modernization hero. Looking at the circumstance, the progressor usually has to act in quiet, secretly, in a civilization which is much lower level compared to his or her communist paradise. Then the idea that this is a representative of a technical intelligence, a researcher, an engineer, a person who has the key to mysteries of science, becomes quite justifiable. Progressors are sort of secret reformers, but of special kind, carriers of a new, specifically new conscience, justified by the society they came from. They try not to meddle too far in the situation of savagery around them. Their strategy is to try to save local intelligentsia and methodically influenced by personal example over the conscience of people who are their neighbors, close to them. It's almost a Christian way, or a rather missionary way. I think that explains why Andrei Tarkovsky tried to make a movie of Strugatsky's Roadside Picnic. He gave the stalkers some elements of an Orthodox fool in Christ and accentuated in his followers the absence of faith and the desire of faith. Despite Tarkovsky, though, Strugatsky would often understand the inner forcefulness of this seemingly forceless discourse. Based on the prerogative of spiritual superiority, it predisposes the fact that progressors would look at their disciples as sort of not full people, somebody below humans. From this stems the final of their hunt to be a god. Ilya Kukulin, present here today, was quite right to show how the progressor project is turned the other way around in Beetle in the Anthill. The ex-progressors, including Rudolf Sikorsky, the same Stranik from the inhabited island, act as a sort of security services and destroy a progressor who is implanted onto Earth by the stranger's civilization. But if you look at the history of progressors as the allegory of modernization effort of the people of the 60s, and the most important texts by Strugatsky are Hard to be a God and Time Wanderers. This shows a parallel development of two interconnected ideologies. The first one is the idea that the society is in principle unreformable, even though the progressors put a lot of effort into this. Even a child could understand that these societies, to this or that extent, represent the Soviet Union. The second idea is the modernization in an inner circle. This motive of an inner circle is very important for Strugatsky, starting from the earliest text. This is connected to special conditions, to the so-called oasis of creative freedom that the Soviet power created for researchers, and they were the places where actually the liberalism of technical intelligence was formed. This also reflects the main method of modernization of the ITI discourse. It's characterized by the opposition of our circle, consisting of some exclusive personalities united by an exceptional mission, versus the crowd, given the fact that their circle is a priori accepted as a modernized society of the future, as a microcosm, trying to drag into its sphere some new co-workers. But as long as in the Monday begins on Saturday, this closed world is painted as a magical world, then in the roadside picnic, the zone is the remainder of the efforts of the progressors from some highly developed civilization, is both attractive and terrible. In the A Beetle in the Ant Hill, this inner circle is discovered as containing a well-conspired secret police inside it, which tries to guard its hermetic status. Finally, in the last novel that Strugatsky planned to write, as Kukulin notes, they attempted to create an empire on the planet Saraksh, consisting of several territories in the form of concentric circles as Dante's Hell. The outer circle is a world of bandits and beggars, based on the rule of force. The middle world is the world of typical bourgeois life, and the central world is the world of beautiful, sublime life, communism style. It's impossible to get from one world into the other world, as a special police sees that people don't cross. The zone of freedom becomes a sort of Rublovka, where some Golden Mile area, where the modernization utopia is faces the modernizers themselves. The scum, unreformable, remains so up to the point of eating each other. It's a very sad and bitter satire on how the strategies of the intelligentsia transformed. Maybe this is the reason why there's no expected resonance when the film by Fyodor Bondarchuk on the Strugatsky's Inhabited Island came out. Maybe the absence of resonance was due to the fact that the Progress's program of modernization in the inner circle found its realization in real life. As you remember, the central motive of the Inhabited Island were special translator towers, which were emitting waves, generating terrible pain of the intelligentsia and euphoric patriotism of most other citizens. The monologue of the progressor in the movie could not generate most direct associations with the so-called 90s. And, well, this did not play out. Maybe it's because the emitting towers are a very primitive explanation of historical catastrophes. There is one more version that you could work out here, a subliminal message to the viewers, because they already know what the way it will come up at the end. The progressors would try to fumble somehow with the economy, inflation, biosphere, mass schizophrenia. They would turn the emitting towers on again, but not in order to control people who want freedom too much, but in order to generate more cash. And the point of generating cash is the moment where the Strugatsky end and the Pelevin begins. The genealogy of this author is also falls into the category of technical intelligentsia quite nicely. A graduate of the Moscow Institute of Power Engineering, wrote for the Chemistry and Life journal, started with social science fiction, but there is a certain difference between Pelevin's heroes and their fathers. The positivist faith in reason and science is substituted by a faith of the irrational, understood as kind of technology, demanding chemical catalyzers, technology transforming the conscience and the world. But this is quite in compliance with the evolution of the technical intelligentsia discourse itself, that passed through the stage of being infatuated with religion, the occult, the esoterics, taking the place of fully destroyed grand narratives of ideologies. It can seem that Pelevin's heroes from the very beginning have no illusion about improving the world around them. They try to perfect themselves, or they try to find a way to get used to this world, but this is a mistaken impression. They really change the world. The best way of action for his characters, which can be most clearly seen at the end of Chapayev and Void, but repeated in also other novels, is to erase reality and move to a beautiful and free world created by their own imagination. This can be read as a solipsistic answer to the defeat of technical intelligentsia utopia, who tried to change the conscience of the society, but it turned out that nobody needs our ideas. That's why we don't have to spend our energy on the ungrateful other. You have to create a perfect world for yourself and your neighbors. And create it using the same strategy, changing conscience, just your conscience and not other conscience. In Generation P, even more notable scenario plays out, also stemming from the disappointment of the ex-progressors. Technologies, irrationally based technologies aimed at the manipulation of mass conscience, become the ground for the almost absolute power of the technical intelligentsia of the new generation. This power is based on deception, on self-deception, on illusion, on dreams, but most importantly on a blinding and hypnotizing universal desire of money. But at the end, it is shown that power built on this foundation has very little difference from the absence of power. It's also illusory and demands from Tatarsky, who has reached the status of a living god, a depersonification. His face appears on every TV commercial and becomes just a symbol of power. But Pelevin still continues the Strugatsky tonics with more tangible irony. The Strugatsky hero became a Luden, a human being of a higher level, and disappeared in the vast spaces of outer space, then practically every character by Pelevin, beginning with Amon Ra and up to his latest novels, pass through an analogous transformation. Everyone becomes a god, but the further on, the more monstrous this transformation becomes. I think this is a transformation of the complex of technical intelligentsia, exceptionalism, or alienation. Pelevin's political technologies, just as they are prototypes from Shedrovitsky to Gleb Pavlovsky, are a full embodiment of cynical modernization, described by Peter Sloterdijk in his critique of the cynical reason. This is a modernized, unhappy consciousness where the Enlightenment has already worked on, not without result, at the same time fully in vain. This is the main result of the work of the progressors, that is, modernizers. Today, the cynic appears as a mass figure, an average social character in the upper echelons of the elevated superstructure. The key social positions in boards, parliaments, commissions, executive committees, publishing companies, practices, faculties, and lawyers and editors' offices have long since become a part of this diffuse cynicism. A certain bitterness provides an undertone to its activity. They know what they are doing, but they do it because, in the short run, the force of circumstances and the instinct for the self-preservation are speaking the same language, and they are telling them that it has to be so. Others would do it anyway, perhaps worse. Thus, the new integrated cynicism even has the understandable feeling about itself of being a victim and of making sacrifices. End of quote. These words of Sloterdijk fit Pelevin's characters very well, with one clarification: their cynicism is not diffuse. It has a proud and demonstrative character.
Блестящий, по-моему, доклад, совмещающий настоящее, прошлое, попытку критической рефлексии, причем с вниманием к современным социальным, политическим.
Alexander Semenov for Imperio. Mark, thank you so much for a great presentation combining the past and present, an attempt of critical reflection with attention to the modern social and political issues. I got a question and a commentary.
Если мы посмотрим на происхождение современной политической элиты, реформаторов,
We have a tendency to see the experience of the Soviet Union in the 20th century as isolated and hermetically sealed from
Мы увидим,
the global
что их
processes.
взросление и их восприятие Запада, которое они
The second
смотрели
part of
в
the
Империи,
commentary, if we
как
look
раз
at the
совпадает с
genesis
положением
of the modern elite, the
неолиберальной
reformers,
парадигмы. Да? Конец 70-х, постиндустриальное общество,
studying in the Kantorovich
рабочие
school,
исчезают,
the
машины
economists who
начинают
follow on
собираться
with the
третьим в
reforms,
мире, неолиберальная парадигма,
we see
которая
that their
сводит
growth and their perception
государство
of
к
the West
машине, а математику, а
coincides
экономику
with the
к
appearance
машине,
of the
а математику.
neoliberal paradigm.
Да? Значит, вот
The end of the
ключевым
50s,
образом это
post-industrial society, workers
пространство, в
disappear,
которое Советский Союз был вписан. Да? Почему я
machinery
говорил
starts being
несколько
assembled in the
о
third
законах,
world, neoliberal
да? Закон
paradigm,
об орудии
reducing the
возможности.
state to a machine
И, собственно, из этих двух
and the
комментариев рождается
economic
вопрос,
to
имеет
mathematics.
ли смысл вот традиционную нашу предрасположенность объяснять
Quite
все
surprisingly, this
скорее
process
локальным историческим
that the Soviet
контекстом,
Union was
да,
involved in,
немножко, так сказать,
because this is the period when the
посмотреть на
international
мировые
trade
процессы и
springs up.
увидеть тем самым кризис демократии, да, кризис
So these two
свободы в
commentaries give
90-х
rise to a
годах, в
question.
том числе и в глобальной перспективе, в глобальном контексте
Maybe it's better to
режима
explain the
неолиберальной
tendency,
экономики,
to
неолиберальной
put the
политики.
tendency to explain our
Давайте вопрос к Игорю
trend
Николаевичу.
to
А,
isolate from the
Саша,
global
спасибо большое
society,
за этот комментарий. Это именно
to
такой
widen it
комментарий,
up
когда мы
and to
говорим,
see
например,
the crisis of the of our society in
не
a
могу
more
сказать,
global
не думал,
context
он не занимался этим вопросом
of the regime
совершенно.
of the
Вот,
neoliberal politics
и,
and economy.
безусловно, здесь есть и параллели, и влияние, и совершенно, собственно, прошедшая конференция
Thank you for
показывает,
the
что
commentary.
все наши
It's really a
представления
commentary.
о автохтонности там, советских даже процессов, они достаточно
I
условные,
cannot say
и
I have
всегда
not
есть
ever thought
множество
of this,
параллелей.
but I've not worked on it anyway.
Но, как,
So this has parallels and some influence,
он состоит в том,
as it was
что
shown at this
и тут
conference.
я не вижу параллели скажем,
As this
с
conference has
американцами,
shown
когда
the
было
idea of
говорили,
autochthonous
свой лучший
nature of the Soviet conflict, very
что
conventional and
в позднем
not
Советском
always
Союзе,
parallels could be
и эта
found.
ситуация меняется в
But my
постсоветский
thesis
период,
is different.
именно культурный дискурс, сформировавшийся в гитлеровской среде, вот, с социализмом, так сказать, с идеей исключительности,
And I
так сказать,
really don't see the parallels with American cultural
он
production
стал
here.
культурным мейнстримом всего либерализма, всего спектра
I do not see it
либерализма.
that in the late
Он
Soviet
стал
Union,
некой вот
in the
этой
post-Soviet
соединительной ткани, которая
period,
объединила разных либералов. Вот.
that the
И в
cultural
этом
discourse
смысле
formed by the
эта
technical
ситуация
intelligentsia,
специфическая,
the discourse of
вот, и она
exceptionalism,
связана, не могу
that
сказать,
this
только с
discourse
советским
became
периодом,
cultural
есть целый ряд
mainstream
причин, которые
of
ее
the
вызвали.
whole liberal
Я не говорю,
spectrum.
там, о кризисе демократических
It became a kind of a fabric that united liberals of different ilk.
вот. Это не вытекает из дискурса в данном случае.
So this is a specific situation which cannot be explained by the Soviet reasons only. I do not talk about the crisis of the
Сейчас особенно
democratic
очевидно
conventions
неадекватность этого
or
дискурса
hopes.
современной ситуации. Вот
This does not directly follow from the
я
discourse,
упомянул, и все это, конечно,
but what does follow from the discourse is
этот термин creative
the
class,
inflexibility,
не критическое
which is especially clear now, and the inadequacy of this discourse to the modern situation.
протестная интеллигенция. Но если посмотреть, собственно, книгу
I mentioned that, and well, everybody knows that anyway, the term of creative class,
это в чистом виде, да? Но ведь в этой книге у него
which has been absolutely uncritically translated and accepted, has been appropriated
аргумент очень
by the protest-minded intelligentsia.
людях, которые продают.
If you look at the actual book written by Richard Florida, we can see that the creative class is really a pure form product of the post-industrial society. I don't have to explain to you that this is a very particular argument. He's talking about people who are selling their creative work. But first of all, he puts sort of a technical intelligentsia, followed by intellectuals, artists, and so on.
Что очень похоже на этот дискурс. Но, что интересно, что как бы
He described the situation as people prefer to live not at the places where jobs are available, but in some preferred areas of American cities. And he says that in this medium, a non-conformism is a kind of conformist feeling. The big and small cities and towns where they choose to live coincide with another piece of research by his colleague who paid attention to the location of the biggest gay communities, and both maps coincide because members of the gay community like to live where you have the most diversity, most tolerance, and the environment which is most conducive to creative work. This is also a result produced by post-industrial society, and when we compare this model with the discussion of Pussy Riot, now underway among the protest intelligentsia in Russia, so we see on the important issues of treating religion and the church, treating feminism, modern art, homosexualism, or anyway the cultural and social otherness, then this discourse stops working. This discourse blocks any attempt to continue reflection on these points and is anyway incompatible with these issues. So here I see a certain difference. Thank you.
Так вот, Марк, я с большим интересом и удовольствием вас послушал, и многие ваши положения мне близки и симпатичны.
In our classification, I'll probably call this ethnologist, an American version. I would call myself an anthropologist. Mark, it was very interesting to hear you, and many of the provisions that you talk about are very close to me. But still I am taking it further with my questions. So I have a whole range of points that I would like to discuss in connection with your presentation, both wide and narrow. I think you're superimposing two things. On the one hand, an elitarian discourse, on the other, mass ideas and mass feelings. I think these are diverse, the distinct things. I see our paths of interest somehow cross. So when I look through fiction and the text of the sorts you're talking about, but I think less about writers and what they produce, but how mass ideas and mass feelings are reflected in this, or how these texts are perceived by the masses. I think that the second and third-rate authors are usually much more interesting. We usually tend to discuss the pinnacle, Dmitry Bykov and others, but these are not my authors, because it's very interesting and very complex in their works. But the second, third, and fourth-rate authors usually don't get a lot of attention paid to them, but they are simpler, they are closer to the masses, and it's more obvious in their work. Whatever you're trying to rack your brain on thinking about the higher profile authors, it's much simpler in their case. So if you talk about mass conscience, I think they're more interesting. A related issue, you featured this but somehow placed it in the social context. So I'm always thinking of such social context and how these things are connected. So take technical intelligentsia, for instance. You said at the end of the 60s and up to the end of the Soviet Union, these are the elite. These are the people who work at a large military complex facilities. But at the beginning of the 90s, they suffered most because everything around them collapsed. And this was a huge trauma for them, which led to very notable consequences, including the change of mood. first they were frustrated, and then many different things happened.
Личности известных. Ну, там, Сахов, Ландау, еще можно перечислять. Ну, тут вы... И потом говорит, что это...
So this dramatic moment is very
Тут
important.
возникает сразу вопрос.
So now,
Все ли представители вот этого класса, так сказать,
you start from particular well-known personalities, Landau and Sakharov, many others.
небольшой, очень заметный, очень видимый, но все
And
же
then you say, this is the discourse of technical intelligentsia.
дело в том, что у нас нет социологических опросов для этого.
But the question is, are all representatives of this class in this group, do they all think so, or are you actually talking about a very small, yes, visible, but a small group? Fortunately, we do not have any mass material, any data backed by sociological surveys. So I see a certain conceptual break here. Some people created a certain text and others created no text, but created very different discourses. And as we know in the West, after all the events of 1968, there was a pushback to neoconservatives. But we had no revolution in 1968. But we'll get several other things happening. And also in the 1970s and 80s, we also have a pushback. The huge masses of neo-religious groups, nationalist movements. There's a lot of things going on. Not just limited to the liberal strand you're talking about. The important thing for me is that the representatives of this environment also took part in other discourses. I think, therefore, you're missing one important stage, Lev Gumilov. Look, who liked him most? Who were most influenced by him? Representatives of this hard science, natural science, not the humanities. The humanities people didn't like him. This is an important parallel. Yeah, I understand the question. So they picked it up. So some small detail. Neo-traditionalism is a term that ethnographers first used in the 1990s. We published a book on neo-traditionalism in the Peoples of the North. The last thing, it's Lukyanenko with his powers of light and powers of darkness. But doesn't it come from the esoteric groups, this light versus darkness? So if you look at the so-called science fiction and fantasy, can't we find a real lot of authors in the second rate and third rate and others with very close contacts to esoterics? I think it comes from the air and through science fiction. I think you are reducing the problem here, watering it down. The real problem is more multicolored. Yeah, I fully accept your reproach about reductionism. Of course, I was hopping on and off, missed many things, and I had neither time nor opportunity to fit everything in. I fully agree when you say when people from this discourse and from this environment very easily move to the spheres of the nationalist and the occult, due to many reasons. Due to the 1990s drama, I fully agree on that here as well. Due to many reasons related to the 1970s, disappointment in the progressist ideology. I'm using the word discourse not because everybody thinks this way, but that people think within the strand of thought, within the structure. I was trying to pinpoint several important structural elements, the double opposition, exclusivity, alienation. These are the elements which are part of the structure. The structure turned out to be flexible. You could put Sakharov-style liberalism into this, or Solzhenitsyn-style nationalism, or the things that you mentioned in your report. These tendencies are present everywhere, beginning from essentialism and culminating in the double opposition. This is the reason for the volatility of this discourse. Concerning the superimposition of the elitarian and mass, I've tried to emphasize that I'm only talking about the intelligentsia discourse. It's the massive elitarian, the elitarian mass conscious. This could be reflected in a manifesto published in the Samizdat or in the late night kitchen talk. Anywhere it's very interesting to look at, whereas the second and the third rate are just epigone-style authors who are repeating the ideas originally put up by somebody first-rate. It's better to analyze the Strugatskys because they are in the vanguard. Yeah, but if we talk about the most popular, it's exactly the authors who I analyzed that are most popular. Concerning Lukyanenko, I fully agree that between the Strugatskys and Lukyanenko lie the heaps of this production, the esoteric production. But I'm interested to have a look at how he leaves the structure intact but replaces the participants. Of course, the Strugatskys pay no interest to the occult. But after all the transformations, I show that the conflict remains the same. Bykov has a very different evolution, very different ideas, and the structural conflict is again preserved intact. I want to reply to Alexander Semyonov. To his point about this being connected to the international global problems. I think the creation of the Intelligentsia discourse was influenced by the ideas of science and intellectual power, as reflected in the Pugwash movement, not the exclusivity, not the exceptionalism of the Soviet Union. The peculiarity of the Soviet experience was that this idea was converted into mass science, mass conscience. So probably the 1970s ideas in the Soviet Union not so easily correlated to neoliberalism. Replying to Mark, concerning his question about the existence of the Soviet Frankenstein, I can reply that you should look at the work of Kiev author of science fiction Vladimir Savchenko, The Discovery of Oneself, 1967. This book reveals an interesting mental feature of the technical intelligence of the Soviet Union, the level of mass stereotypes. When they re-educate Frankenstein, in this book, a scientist named Krivosheyev creates a clone of himself, which is an unsuccessful attempt. The clone is born with the unhappy consciousness and sent to the Far East to work where he's re-educated, changes his character, and becomes a happier man. My commentary on the lecture now. Many important issues have been touched in the lecture. I'd like to emphasize one important thing, which Viktor Schnirelmann mentioned in his remark. Addressing the younger part of the audience, I must say that the Soviet core of the technical intelligentsia was created by the military complex, but their crisis is connected with the crisis of the military facilities. So the two short statements at the end. First important statement number one. One of the psychological sources of essentialism you are talking about is the feeling of fundamental insecurity and being unsure about the Soviet intelligentsia due to their double position. They had to work only for the state, but at the same time perceived this as totally unfair. So they had to justify their position in the eyes of themselves. So I think this influenced the demonstrative and performative machismo that many male intellectuals displayed. But it also influenced their belief that everything should be placed firm in its place. So this deepened the intellectual chasm even further. As I see it, the essentialism is a sort of privatized essentialism of the Soviet ideology, which would just appoint characters to be either bourgeois with permanent nature or a proletarian with permanent nature. So when this becomes a privatized treasure of a small group, I think it's important that not everything that has been going on in the 1950s was due to the evolution of the technical intelligentsia. Many of the ideas that Mark was mentioning was inherited from the ideas of the early 20th century, 1910 to 1930s. For example, in the quotation you gave from Kormer, obviously goes back to the works of Gershenzon and the Vehie collection. So these accusations of being Philister being thrown at the opposition of progress were again not very new for that period of time. They were first voiced by Konstantin Postovsky in 1957 by a man with a pre-revolutionary education. His speech was later widespread in Samizdat, and there he said that the Stalin's regime was a block in the way of progress because it stimulated a Philister society, Philister ideas. This speech became one of the pillars of the technical intelligentsia discourse, but this interpretation comes from a man who had a pre-revolutionary education, and he was, though part of intelligentsia, in a way part of the technical intelligentsia. Well, actually, Postovsky's projected the situation of the 1920s into the 1950s, and the clarification of this came only later. Yeah, thank you for your commentary. Savchenko is a real fine, thank you. Concerning science as a political power, this is a topic debated since the days of Daniel Bell in the 1930s. And in Hollywood movies, the image of a deranged on the one hand, life-changing on the other hand scientist also appears in the 1930s. He's talking about political, or as you mean, moral influence of science?
С одной стороны, собственно, как бы вот то, что по-английски называется hard science, да? Вот, а с другой стороны, конечно же,
And talking about
то, что Петр
essentialism
сказал,
as a
инверсия
compensation
советской
for
идеологии. То есть, как
insecurity.
берутся советские
That may be
категории,
true,
и
so I
они переосмысливаются, но остаются
gladly
советскими.
accept your change.
Вот. А что касается того, что Корнер цитирует Вехи,
So
ну, Корнер
on the other hand, that's truly what they
уже
call in English hard
как бы в
science.
данном случае выступает уже как критик этого
On the
сознания.
other,
То есть
this is
он
an
с одной
version of a
стороны
Soviet
с одной
ideology. You
стороны,
take the
конечно,
Soviet categories
его критикует,
and
но для того, чтобы
rethink
его
them, but
критиковать,
they
он должен
remain
выйти
dependent.
за пределы парадигмы, и он обращается, конечно же, к религиозной философии человека.
As far as it concerns, Corner quoted from the Vehi Milestones book. Corner acts as a critic of this conscience. He criticizes this consciousness, but you obviously have to leave the confines of this paradigm, and that's why he addresses Russian religious philosophy.
Мне кажется, тебе надо взять для полного комплекта книжку Леши Евчика, который как раз
Sergei Ushakin.
интеллигенции ради механики.
Mark, I'm glad you're doing this all. I only have one idea and one offer and two questions. You don't have to end up with Pelevin.
Первый вопрос. Я согласен с диагнозом.
Take a book by Leszolczyk, who is a representative of this technical intelligentsia, who came up with a very interesting theory of applied use of Sloterdijk and double conscience. The questions. Question number one is, I agree with the diagnosis and the picture you painted, but I don't understand two things. The nature of conservatism of technical intelligentsia. Because on the one hand, you presuppose that they are the movers of progress, which progress forces them to invent something new every time. So you remember this old magazines of the past, they would be full of this information about little tips and tricks. So it all taught how to perceive the existing structure and not to accept it as a given. So what comes out of the structure? This natural intellectuality that Ilya was talking about? So the second point is that I do not understand how do you move from conservatism to subjectivity and the double conscious. So if you take Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn, and how do you pass from them to Kormer? So the conservatism is not typically characterized by double consciousness. It usually is a more structurized. A double conscious is more characteristic for neurotic intelligence. Okay, I got it, thank you. Concerning Gerchuk, I would think about it. Talk about conservatism. I want to make a more specific point. The problem is not about the conservatism of the conscious, but the conservatism in its cultural sense. Talking about the conservatives of the cultural conscience, which is not described as a sympathy for liberal ideas or conservative ideas. They are mutually replaceable. But the resistance to making things complex instead of making them simple. I think the thing we face here is the result of the fact that the scientific type of discourse is moved over into culture. It's projected over creative work and the perception of art. We found out that particularly in the post-Second World War, you can call them post-avant-garde, socialist realist culture. In this culture, you still obviously, objectively have the tendency for complexity going up.
Насчет Кормера, я полагаю, что
There's a gap
двойное
between
сознание,
the cultural
между, я
tendencies and the
полагаю,
conscience,
в
which
моем
projects
видении,
over the cultural reality.
видении, это
So
двойное
it could
сознание,
be
вот,
a
которое
modernizing conscience, but
я описал, это
anti-modernist conscience, and this
диагноз
is the problem.
человека отчасти постороннего, старающегося быть посторонним. Да?
Concerning
Что же
Cormer, I think that
возникает
double
в
conscience,
самом дискурсе, это двойное, вот то, что я назвал
in my
двойной
view,
негативностью. С одной стороны, противостояние абсурдной экспрессной системе, с другой стороны, невежественной массы,
double conscience
которая
as diagnosed
совершенно
by
не
Cormer, in my
развивает,
view,
в общем-то, уверенность в себе. Но вот именно эта двойная негативность, она трансформируется в сценическое двойное сознание. Именно
as
она
appearing in the
является вот
discourse in the
тем
form of double
механизмом, который в
negativity,
ходе своей эволюции доходит до,
is
собственно говоря,
characterized by, on the one hand, the
я бы так
opposition to the state machine, on the other to
не
the
знаю, насколько ты убедишь.
ignorant masses. But this very double negativity is transformed into the cynical consciousness. This double negativity then is the mechanism which passes a certain evolution and leads to a cynical reason.
Степени объяснительной силы дискурс-анализа. Потому что мне кажется, что немножко в вашем докладе
Mark, thank you for a very interesting report. I'd like to ask you
возможности дискурса формировать
what
какие-то
your position
процессы
is, in your opinion,
так сказать,
concerning the degree of the explanatory power of discourse analysis.
некие факторы, которые влияют на
I think that your presentation overstates the opportunities of the discourse and the potential for the discourse to form underground processes. Because discourses are very important, but except for discourse, there are other factors which influence the political, social, and economic phenomena. So if we look through the eyes of the discourse, it's hard to explain why the essentialist discourse of the 19th century expresses itself or coexists in a very different social and political economic situation, and on the other hand, an extremely socialist discourse now. I think if you just look at discourse only and explain everything via discourse, maybe we're just reading the modern situation in a different way. But I think that essentialism now is more powerful than it has been in the 1960s. Despite the fact that we have access to literature, which helps not just simplify but make the situation more complex, there is no demand for this literature. And so the situation concerning essentialism is only getting worse. And when you said about the discourse of the 60s, I think you have to pay attention to the fact that the people producing this discourse, Sakharov, Solzhenitsyn and others, they are still in the dialogue with their sources, with the past authors. Probably Solzhenitsyn is influenced by his technical education. His ideology has received an impact from that. But the fact that Slavophiles were viewed by him as people who possessed the ultimate truth is also very important. So the problem of the intelligentsia of the 1960s and 70s is that they want to get beyond the boundaries of the discourse. But what sources do they find on the way? The modern literature of the past, but it's not widely available, and even if they read something in foreign languages, it's 19th and early 20th century, so it's basically authors of the past as sources. Thank you for your question. It's hard to judge about whether I overstate or understate the power of discourse analysis. My task is different. With very wide brush marks, I decided to paint this discourse and show that discourse exists not just in the works of certain authors, but it exists as liberal cultural mainstream. The influence of this discourse is a very separate question. I've mentioned some things, but far from using this discourse to explain the whole cultural situation. Whatever you say about essentialism now being more important than in the 1960s, even though there is no excess then and there is excess now, but no desire, this is a confirmation of the fact that the story I tried to tell has its consequences. There are in fact many essentialist discourses. This is not the only one, and it has to be studied. Unfortunately, we don't do discursive maps, which have to be made. But if I have been as bold as to say that this discourse became mainstream for the liberal consciousness, then I think that the effect that you talked about is largely due to this. Concerning Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn and dialogue from the past, you're surely right. But when we read Solzhenitsyn, the very style of his writing and his way of thinking is a Soviet party documentation style that he's polemizing against. He works inside the same style, however strange this could seem. Solzhenitsyn, that's Slavophiles and Dostoevsky. But the thing is, for me, I see a certain important difference between the Slavophile culture and ideology of the 19th century and the early 20th century, and Solzhenitsyn, on the other hand, that Solzhenitsyn is a sort of Slavophile views which has passed through the technical intelligentsia culture and turned into something new, though similar. So here I think the participation of the technical intelligentsia discourse, same as with nationalist discourse, can be helped to explain. Thank you again. Sergei Glebov of Imperio. Thank you, Mark, for your interesting presentation. Very, very interesting. When I was listening to you, I had a small sort of fear that we're talking about a new model of Russian history. When first there was the military complex, which gave birth to technical intelligentsia, who gave birth to progress, and then they destroyed this. They used the opportunity to destroy the Soviet Union and promote the reforms. I know this is not your logic, but this is just the way it's interpreted concerning the absence of democracy at the moment. So I think it's a general question, and I don't know if you had a chance to think about that. The Soviet Union was a complex multi-ethnic society, and the logic of setting it up in different parts of the Soviet Union was different. The republics of the Central Asia were in many ways helped by humanitarian investment and developing the studies of language and history. So there is a question of how this discourse functioned, if functioned at all, in the situations where you cannot definitely prove the presence of the technical intelligentsia consciousness. So I'm not ready to answer that, but in continuation of this topic, Shahidinova Svetlana, Department of Journalism and Sociology, Kazan University. I've been listening to your presentation with a lot of interest. Moving on. I think that your idea of the principle of mass salutarity is illustrated in Soviet journalism. If you look once again at ideologized newspapers, newspapers, if you look at the so-called thick magazines, that what the technical production of university spaces is Novosibirsk University campus.
Публицистика и журналистика. Публицистика — понятие, которое в Германии и в России только есть.
So
Она
as
метафизическая, я использую слово не эссенциалистская, а метафизическая, в
is
отличие
where
от
people included into
журналистики,
the
которая
field
сейчас не
and have
рыночная,
made a
поэтому
lot
она
of
практически
research of
совершенно
this.
другая. И эта публицистика,
We
это
know
и
that
грань,
there
не
was a
обязательно
lot
только
of
романы, это и
journalism.
братья Акрановские,
There's a lot
это
of
и
what in the
Евгений
Soviet
Мухов,
Union
и
they
все
called
это
publicism.
очень хорошо вписывается вот в этот
It was not really socialist. It was, unlike journalism, it was more metaphysical.
Сергей, вот у меня, спасибо, сделал комментарий, я еще это не успел немножко подумать.
So this public writing, the Agranovsky
Насчет схемы
brothers,
Сталин создал
Evgeny
ВПК,
Mosov,
Сережа, если ты хочешь эту
goes very
идею
well as
отстаивать,
part of
и
the technical
вот как
intelligentsia
вот
discourse.
Авраам родил Исаака,
Thank you for your comment.
я за это ответственность не несу.
Still
Это
like to
плод
stick with
твоего
my reply to
фантазма.
Sergei.
Вот, это не мои. Я насчет вот вопроса про другие
Concerning the model
схемы,
that Stalin
я
has
тоже
created
с
in
ним
the
не
military
готов.
complex
Я бы
and so
сказал,
on, if you want to stand up for
вот
this
почему.
idea,
Сейчас, минуточку, я забуду, что
Abraham gave birth to Isaac, sort of logic, and then you can stick to it. This is the figment of your imagination.
Она
Concerning the question
соотносится,
of alternative
так, я бы
models,
сказал, боком с
can I reformulate the
теорией
question?
внутренней
Give me a
колонизации,
second,
которую
please.
развивает известный многие Александр
For me,
потому что
the logic I've been trying to follow and
почему
explain
боком? Потому что
is
в том исполнении, которое я вам показал,
correlated in a certain side
внутренняя
way
колонизация тоже является в своем роде
to
фантазмом.
the theory of internal
Она является
colonization as
фантазмом
developed by
внутренней
Alexander Etkind.
интеллигенции. И, так сказать, вот этот ИТР-дискурс, возникающий
Why in a certain side way?
революции, это и есть как бы фантазия интеллигенции,
Because
считающая
the
себя
form of the
колонизаторами
presentation I've
как бы
chosen for
внутри,
today,
извне, а внутри.
internal colonization is also a kind of
Если думать, скажем, о Сахаре
phantasm
Солженицыне,
created by the
то,
intelligentsia.
вот именно этот фантазм внутренней колонизации очень
So the technical
хорошо виден.
intelligentsia discourse of the 60s,
Сахар
which
осуществляет себя
the evolution we've seen,
с модернизатором
is a
и
phantasm of the
колонизатором, да,
intelligentsia
а
which
Солженицын
considered itself
осуществляет себя
colonizers
с
internally.
колонизируемым этими самыми интеллигентными народами.
So if you think about Sakharov and Solzhenitsyn again,
В общем, достаточно
then the
симметрично.
phantasm of internal colonization
Именно
can be easily noticeable.
поэтому вот я так это,
Sakharov,
если помещать это в контекст,
thinks that he is a modernizer, colonizer,
вот в этом контексте
and
я бы
Solzhenitsyn identifies himself with the colonized population, colonized by these modernizers, but this still is a very symmetrical structure.
они пересекаются. Но на этот вопрос, который вы готовы ответить значительно
So if
лучше.
placing it
То
in
есть
the context
именно
of
так,
colonial
как
diction,
происходит пересечение внутренней колонизации или фантазма внутренней колонизации.
I would rather talk about it in this context.
Колонизация внешней, в других средах, я думаю, и здесь
Then your question, of course, it has certain bearing because internal and external colonization get the area where they overlap. Still, you are better prepared to answer this question than I do. How the overlapping of internal and external colonization happens in both environments is a part of a bigger question.
Но мне просто для вашего доклада мне стало немножко грустно, потому что у меня сложилось впечатление, что
Денис Гараев.
тот тезис, который вы выдвигаете, что вот именно ИТР-дискурс
Once again, want to extend my thing to Mark.
постсоветский
I
либерализм,
have two questions.
то мне такое впечатление, что фактически мы оказались в ситуации
After your presentation, I feel a bit sad because I had an impression
поскольку, как вы говорите, что если
that your thesis
имела место критика, да, науки и просвещения, то,
of how technical intelligence influenced the genesis of Soviet and post-Soviet liberalism.
это не присутствует.
So don't we end up in the situation of
В общественной мысли и такой вот в научной мысли
closed positivism?
имеем такой результат вот этого просвещенческого такого позитивистского
When we say that in the West there was criticism of enlightenment and science,
сразу в голове всплыло имя
can we say that in the Soviet Union
его можно было. По-моему, типичным был бы вот именно советский настоящий.
Вы понимаете,
the results of
я
the
сейчас отвечу на первый вопрос.
enlightenment positivist approach? happened to them in the Soviet Union.
массовой западной
The second
культуре есть
question.
два главных архетипа, которые повторяются в течение уже там
Forcefully reminded of
Это
electronic
типа и
from
драма.
the
Да?
TV series about a
Это
robot
архетип
concerning a
кошмара,
Frankenstein.
создаваемый научным, там, техническим и социальным прогрессом. Электроник не создает кошмар.
Well, the answer is that in
Он не
Western
создает,
culture
это не
the two main
кошмарный тип,
archetypes
это
which
совсем
have
другой.
been repeated
Да?
over
То есть не
for
всякий
over
род
100
роман
years. It's Frankenstein and
Франкенштейн.
Dracula.
Это кошмарное порождение прогресса, которое оборачивается
Frankenstein is the
в
archetype of a
импрессионизм.
nightmare created by
Вот
social
я
and scientific
вот
progress. Electronic creates no nightmare.
Этот Роберт,
It's not a nightmarish character, it's a very different
Про
character.
электроника, вот опять же, «Присущая земля» написал очень любопытную статью в сборнике
Frankenstein is a terrible child of progress turning against its creator.
Потому что Евгений Велтистов, который писал книгу
I've given an example of the movie about Robert named Robert.
Он был инструктором отдела ЦК, курировавшим
Concerning
в свою
electronic,
очередь колмогоровский
Ilya
проект по
Kukulin,
созданию
present
спецшкол
here,
вот этих
read a good article about him, published in the
Вот, а сами эти спецшколы, конечно же, были
collection
частью более
of
широкого этеровского проекта,
articles
создание новой
that says
элиты, именно прямое воплощение вот этой сахаровской.
that proves that the author of the prototype book on electronic was written by a man who's a party instructor working with the Kolmogorov project on creating specialized mathematical schools, which had the task of creating new elite
Предложил некоторую модель объяснения.
in direct implementation of the Sakharov quote when they say that you have to teach people how to think scientifically and then the social change will happen.
Но если как бы совершенно по-дилетантски изучать, надо просто
As far as it concerns positivism,
размежевание либерального дискурса. Нужно делиться.
I would venture a certain explanation.
Что как бы российский либерализм,
So
он должен как
your question I take as a what to do sort of question. That's not to me. But if you persist, I think the answer is you just have to split the liberal discourse. You have to understand that Russian liberalism must find some new ways out of the liberal paradigm at the same time remaining in the liberal paradigm. That's my dilettante offer, but so you have to split. The question is,
Я не понял ваш вопрос. Это название книги? Нет, это называется книга «Слотerdijk». И она вышла в 1987 году.
cynicism of reason, which period are you talking about? The 70s or the 90s or the 80s? I don't quite understand your question. It's the title of a book. It's the title of a book by Sloterdijk, which was published in 1987. I was just born there.
То есть ваш вопрос,
So
какое
from
место
this
занимает в парадигме Бога?
reaches board.
Ну, где? Я не понял. Нет, я хочу здесь вопрос. То есть место Бога в этой цитате, в моем докладе.
So we're short of time. Please let's not get away from the
В моем
subject.
докладе Бога.
So your question is, what is the space of God in this? Where, God where? I don't quite understand. Please, I'll answer. Do you mean the place of God in this quotation or in my report? In my report there is no God.
Интеллигенция должна была
Next
приносить
question.
пользу государству и вот всей основной массе, опосредованно государству.
I've got it that liberalism
Государством, то есть государство
in our intelligentsia
анализировало вот эту пользу, определяло ее,
grew in the sort of opposition with the state.
политическим, экономическим, то есть куда продвинулась империя. Да? Вот.
When intelligentsia have to be useful to the state,
Интеллигенция попадает совершенно в другую ситуацию, которая тоже конструируется государством.
to the authorities and indirectly to the state.
Когда польза интеллигенции, в том числе инженеров,
And
она
the state
измеряется
measured
экономическими, говорили в первую очередь,
the usefulness of intelligentsia and the progress it creates.
И если до этого
And now
интеллигенция
intelligence is in a very different situation.
доминирующей идеологии выражала там в художественном
When it's being pressured by the state and the corporations as well,
куда она пойдет, чтобы выразить
when the usefulness of the intelligentsia is measured economically. So if the dissatisfaction and protest against the dominant ideology, how is this protest going to be expressed and made indirect
Конечно, порождает художественный дискурс, я же переводил.
at the present moment? How can intelligentsia now express itself?
Кто такие Пелевины?
So the transformation of discourse into a different sphere.
Ну вот, допустим, если, то есть и также, то есть сейчас это будет измеряться в деньгах.
Does it happen? Yeah, of course it's.
Я не очень понял суть вопроса. Понимаете, я просто не уловил суть вопроса. Я полагаю, что...
Where will the intelligentsia go? So who then are the Pelevins and the Strugatskis?
Вот это двойное противостояние, вот эта двойная негативность по отношению к государству, по отношению, так сказать, как угодно.
Didn't quite get the essence of your question, probably. I think that this double negation, this double negativity in the relations with the state and with the people, what they called Philisters in the 1960s and what they call scum now. So it remains the same. The content area remains the same. The ways of expressing the discourse, with all the obvious difference, there was no internet and no Facebook in the 1960s. If you look at the discursive element, it has to be analyzed. That's why I didn't quite understand your question. The society has not changed that radically. So if you think that in the past the scientific contribution was marked, somehow graded by the state, and now it's being assessed by the corporations, then it's a kind of vain question, because for a scholar there is not much of a difference. Like taking part in a military project would bring you a Lenin Prize, which would still net you a lot of money, so it's not just a matter of prestige in the past. Being part of the elite of science not be measured in prestige and academic titles, but also in higher pensions and so on, and good flats. So I do not see a principal difference of the particular way how these benefits have been delivered to people. So after all, it's all rolled down to money. And the fact that dissatisfaction was represented by, reflected upon in the creative work, the creative protest work in the 1960s, it's still the same. Yes, in the 1960s it was hard to get it. You have to use the samizdat and tamizdat mechanism. Now it's easily accessible. Because there is the issue of concentration and the forbidden fruit, which is sweet, and the sort of inflation of the widely accessible protest. But in the plane that you are asking the question, I don't see it. So this, if we're talking about the degree of freedom, if we take Feyerabend, who demands absolute freedom, because in the condition of the relative freedom, we can talk about a different level of liberation. I don't quite follow what you mean by absolute freedom, freedom from political and social and economic and other forms of pressure. This is the Pelevin version. This is the Pelevin scenario. I can be an absolute conformist, but I create my own inner world where I'm absolutely free. And this is the only version where you can really be absolutely free.
В том числе, то, что пишет Рабин, действия ученых, например, в школе. И вот этот эссенциализм,
But this is in a different conditions from the one described by Feyerabend.
то есть он предлагает цепь качеств. Я думаю, что если этот проект будет реализован,
Вот вы тоже переводите в плоскость, что
So
делать.
maybe it's about
А я
the
говорю,
capturing of the society and the liberation of the society, as Feyerabend writes.
Я хотел сказать,
Liberation from essentialism,
Пол Фейерабен
which is represented in schools.
утопию освобождения науки и освобождения знания.
I think if this project becomes
Вы
realized.
спрашиваете, будет ли она
But you're also moving it into the plane and into the sphere of what is to be done, not giving answers about what is to be done.
относится напрямую с темой доклада
I would like to say
Lipovetskyого, потому что вопрос
Feyerabend
вы задаете
creates a
вопрос
methodological
ценностей
utopia
и идеалов,
of liberating
а
knowledge.
значит, Марк рассказывает, что происходит.
If you're asking if it's going to be realized, now I'm asking about how it could be realized. So this is in no direct connection to the topic of Mark's presentation, because you're talking about the level of values and ideals, whereas they're being talked about what's happening. So that was the final question. Okay, no, one more. We'll take one more. You started by talking about technical intelligentsia. Can be almost equal with modern creative class. The role that was played by technical intelligentsia in the past is now played by the creative class. Can you just give 2 or 3 examples, keeping it short? Because I think that modern creative class is a bit different.
Гульнара, я немного говорил об этом, поэтому я не буду повториться, вот отвечая на вопрос Саши. Я как раз, я упомянул, что как бы протестное движение использовало термин креативный класс.
And
Вот,
there is a lot of feelings of going back to the USSR rather than liberalism.
оно похоже на креативный класс, но креативный
I
класс
talked
не
about that
является.
a little bit,
В том
so
смысле,
I'm not going to be repeating myself.
Если же, опять же, судить по, так сказать,
I was saying that the protest movement was using the terminology of creative class, whereas I think that in the strict sense, it looks like creative class, but it's not creative class in the Richard Florida sense.
на мой взгляд, именно, так сказать,
If you
слабости
judge
протестного
from the
движения связаны
discussions happening
именно
now
с зависимостью
after
от этой радиации.
the protest and around the actions of protest,
Что же произошло сегодня?
then the presence of this discourse and the transformed form is widely felt.
Я бы поэтому здесь не употреблял бы слово
So the weakness of the protest movement is directly linked to its dependence on the discourse of technical intelligentsia. That's what I would say.
Собственно, уже и отвечает, уже есть первый исследование на тему.
So if you talking about who the people are that go out and protest today, so this is not a question I could answer. A sociologist probably should. So actually, there are some studies in this field already done. Final question.
Националистический дискурс, он
Probably
все-таки развивался
clarification.
параллельно, но он похож, они симметричны по своей структуре. Поэтому между ними
When you're
возможны
talking about
переходы и согласования.
social movements of this year, the fact that the nationalist discourse takes a lot more space in the social space, is that an example of influence of the technical intelligentsia? The nationalist discourse and the technical intelligentsia discourse have been developed on parallel lines, and they are similar in many ways. Thank you so much.